let's walk through some of this material in chapter 24. So whether or not verse 3 contains 3 questions or 1 question on the disciples' part, I'm taking it that Jesus understands it as one question. As one question. So when will this be? This being the destruction of the temple. Your coming, now we're going to talk about what that means, and the close of the age all mean the same thing. Okay? So, and remember the context, Jesus' prediction of the destruction of the temple, remember the Davidic themes that we've already emphasized, right? It's the house of David only that is to build the great end times temple. So in verses 4 through 12, he's basically saying the time is not yet, verse 5. And though you will have false messiahs, nations rising against nations, earthquakes, famines, all kinds of cataclysmic signs and so forth, do not believe that that is the mark of the destruction of the temple and the end of the age and so forth, right? Nonetheless, he does say in verse 13, the one who endures to the end will be saved. Now, what does saved mean in Matthew? Again, 1:21, saved from his sins. And so the righteousness that Jesus is building up to pay out for our sins, which I've already commented, he is definitely talking about that right here when he's talking about getting after the cross. Endurance and stick-to-itness, not falling away from Jesus, just like we saw in Mark, is what Matthew has in mind here, up to whatever this end is. And this gospel will be preached throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Well, where else do we read of the end with more clarity but in Matthew 28:19? I am with you always to the close or the end of the age. Matthew 28:20, to the end of the age. Now there, Jesus is talking after the cross, right? It's after the cross. So the age is somehow beyond this point. What would help? Maybe green. Beyond this point right here, because the resurrection has already happened, right? Does that make sense? So the end of the age is beyond the resurrection. And I would argue to this final peak here. Because what has to happen before we reach the end of the age? Verse 14. This testimony must go to the whole world, or the kingdom must be preached throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations. Where else do we read about all nations? Chapter 28. Go into all nations, verse 19. You follow me? So whatever the end of the age is, the gospel of the kingdom to all nations must happen in that time. Then comes the end. Does that make sense? So what Jesus has done here is he's basically skipped the question. When will this happen? He's spoken right beyond it. He's spoken beyond the temple now to the time when gospel preaching to all nations, a la chapter 28:19, go into all nations, preaching them, I'm with you to the end of the age, can be accomplished. Until that can be accomplished. Okay? So that's where we are in verse 14. Verse 15. So when you see the desolating sacrilege spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop go down and take not what is in his house and flee, and so on and so forth. And then come all these persecutions for the people. What is the desolating sacrilege spoken of by Daniel? In 1 Maccabees chapter 1, we read this. Now on the 15th day of Chislev, on the 145th day, they erected a desolating sacrilege on the altar of burnt offerings. So they also built altars around the surrounding towns of Judah. In chapter 2, verse 27, then I'll just stop right there. Okay, so in 1 Maccabees, he's describing when Antiochus IV sacrificed a pig on the altar in Jerusalem, right? But the value here, so the writers of 1 Maccabees think they're fulfilling Daniel. But because Jesus brings Daniel up again, tells us Jesus doesn't think 1 Maccabees was the fulfillment of Daniel. Another reason why the Apocrypha is not included, should not be included in the canon. Jesus is right here contradicting it, that 1 Maccabees 154 was not the fulfillment of Daniel's expectations. What is the fulfillment of Daniel's expectations? Again, I would argue it's crucifying Jesus. It's crucifying Jesus. And at which point everybody who follows him should flee to the mountains, because that is when the persecution is then to follow. Verse 27, for as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. So there he's now turning to that part of the question, when will this be, and what will be the sign of your coming? So will the coming of the Son of Man be. And when he says lightning flashes from the east to the west, I think what he means is it will be perfectly clear. It'll be observable, perfectly clear to all, and understandable, which I believe is Jesus' point. After the resurrection, everything makes sense. Wherever the body is, the eagle will be gathered together. The eagle is a symbol of Rome. And so is he talking about the armies of Rome coming to the temple in AD 70? Maybe. Or is he talking about the fact that it's the Romans who crucified Jesus? It's the Romans who crucified Jesus. Again, he can talk about both at the same time. With that, we come to verse 29, and this is where I think 29 through 31, I hope, is where my reading can really crystallize and make sense. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the heaven, and the powers of the heavens of the earth will be shaken. Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then all the tribes on earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to another. That sounds so much like this point right here, doesn't it? The end of the age, doesn't it? You have the moon not giving its light, the sun darkened, the stars falling from the sky, powers of heaven shaking. The Son of Man will appear in the heaven, and the tribes of mourning, he will see him coming. It just sounds so much like the end of the age. However, the principal background here is two things. Number one, the Old Testament language of the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord is, in the Old Testament, is often described in such cosmic, cataclysmic images. And usually the first horizon of fulfillment is not a total upheaval of the universe, but a military destruction as a form of Yahweh's wrath, right? So the day of the Lord is a time when Yahweh judges his enemies. The second background is Daniel 7. Again, we read this yesterday, and when Daniel 7, the Son of Man rides the clouds from earth into the presence of the Ancient of Days, right? He doesn't come from heaven to earth. He comes from earth to heaven. And if that's the background here, which of course it is, they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with great power and glory. I think we have to hold open the possibility of the interpretation that Jesus is talking about his resurrection and ascension right here. That he will come not from heaven to earth, but from earth to heaven. because that's what Daniel 7 expects. If this is the return of Jesus from heaven to earth, then he's inverting Daniel chapter 7 in doing so. But there's no sign that he's doing that any kind of inversion like that. And so I think what Jesus is talking about here is that in the sun and the moon and the stars and so forth, as a symbol of God's judgment on the day of the Lord, therefore he's talking again about the cross. He's talking about the cross. That the day of the Lord of the Old Testament, used in cosmic language, is now being applied to the cross, the hour that is about to come for Jesus. And so on the cross, that's the moment of God's judgment upon sinners. And so therefore, the day of the Lord has begun at the cross. And then equally, verse 30 then, the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven is Jesus' resurrection. When he is raised to earth is when he ascends, raised from the dead, is when he then ascends further to the right hand of God and receives what he says in chapter 28, all authority on heaven and earth. All authority on heaven and earth is parallel to the dominion and power and everlasting kingdom from Daniel 7. And he receives that not when he returns at the end of 2,000 years, but when he is raised from the dead in this very book. Verse 31 then, he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other, is the Great Commission. This is apocalyptic and symbolic language. And in this case, the angels represent the apostles who are told to go and teach among the nations. They are, in turn, therefore, gathering the elect, gathering those to whom the Father has revealed the Son, and the Son reveals the Father. Like chapter 11, from one end of heaven to the other is another way of saying from amongst all the nations of the earth. So verses 29 is the cross, verse 30 is the resurrection and ascension, and 31 then is the Gentile mission of Jesus' disciples, wherein Jesus promises to be with them to the very end of their mission, to the end of the age. To put it another way, Jesus is principally focusing on his own cross and resurrection and then subsequent Gentile mission to call in the elect who endure to the end and therefore are saved at that end point. And he might view beyond that. He might be viewing beyond that with some of that Ezekielian background. But this is what Jesus is talking about, my interpretation, in verses 29, 30, and 31. And it's the principal point here that the reason the temple, this all started with talking about the temple, is because what the temple means is the presence of God, but Jesus is the true presence of God, which they destroy, and the presence of God is restored to earth as he is with his people in the resurrection. And then when he returns at the true end of the age, then, it will be full, unmediated presence of God. He will be with us, we will be with him, we will be his people, and he will be our God. That's how the temple and the destruction of the temple, discussion of destruction of the temple, is able to open up the avenues for an apocalyptic speech where he's actually talking about the cross, resurrection, and the Gentile mission. But no one knows the hour or the day when this is going to take place. And so therefore you're holding your breath until you get to chapter 26 and you realize, the hour truly is the cross. And the coming of the Son of Man on the clouds to receive dominion and authority and power forever is when Jesus says, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me, after his resurrection, and then sends those angels to gather the elect in telling them to go amongst all the nations. Let me stop there. Hear any questions you might have. The end of the age and how the angels will gather up yes, this is what I'm talking about when I say these three peaks are lined up. So when you look at them, or you call them prisms. I like that because you can see through a prism, right? And so, yes, that works. my only hesitation is, I would say, let's just make sure that the first horizon gets plenty of dew, because that's what happens in these actual pages. What does it mean in Matthew 28, or what is it going to look like as Jesus is with us until the end of the age? You know what I mean? Matthew doesn't tell us. We experience that now. We know what it was, how Jesus has been with his people for 2,000 years. And so we can say more now. And when Jesus returns, that will be the next and last redemptive historical event that then interprets other things. And so I think we'll know more at that point, even as we're learning more throughout church history. And that interpretation, these interpretations, of course, all make sense, especially given Revelation. You know what I mean? But it's off beyond Matthew. You know what I mean? It's Matthew 28, closing the book and say, okay, now go live for Christ with all these promises. You know what I mean? It's not in the text of Matthew. So that being the case, I'm not going to deny these extra interpretations, because I mean, I'm drawing this picture, but I just want to make sure that this gets it bears the weight that it should in your interpretation, because of the way chapter 26 is like inching us towards the day, the hour. Can't you watch? You're falling asleep. Boom, the hour is upon us. Really wants us to zero in on the cross and the resurrection, again, as that moment where you see the Son of Man coming on the clouds. He says to the high priest, you will see the Son of Man. This generation will not pass away before the Son of Man comes, right? And that's the resurrection. And I think if we neglect that, and I'm not saying you are, but sometimes the tendency is to neglect that for this, I just think we miss out on a lot. We miss out on the idea that, hey, this whole time has been kingdom. But here's the big upshot. Here's the upshot of all this. What this means is the kingdom is now. Jesus has drunk the cup to take him into the kingdom. He has the authority and the power. He's seated on David's throne. He has the dominion spoken of in Daniel 7, all because of the resurrection, right? And what more is to come will theologically align with that. And so that's why I say, yeah, I hear what you're saying. But I really want us to be able to emphasize that the kingdom is not something in the future. Some people do speak this way. The kingdom will be here when Jesus returns. I think Matthew is making it very clear, as is Mark. The kingdom is upon us. The kingdom is now. And I'm telling you this story. Mark, I'm telling you the story. Matthew, I'm telling you this story, so that by the time you get to the end of it, you will understand that the kingdom is fully arrived. And the king is ruling over not just Israel, but all the nations. And when we look at Luke, I think Luke is doing the same thing, especially in the book of Acts, when Jesus is asked, will you now restore the kingdom to Israel? The basic answer is yes, the kingdom is restored in the pages of this book. The next 28 chapters are a description of the restoration of the kingdom, not just to Israel, but to the whole globe. Right? But that's later today or tomorrow. When Jesus is arrested, we already looked at this yesterday. When Jesus is arrested, Jesus also says it again to the high priest, you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. Again, that idea, you will see means what? It's got to happen imminently. It's got to happen before the high priest dies. It's right around the corner, right? This generation will not pass away. You will see. You will have not finished going through all the towns of Israel. Are not early Christian expectations of Jesus' return within their lifetime, but Jesus' expectation of his ascension to David's throne within their lifetime, which happened at the resurrection. And that's also becomes clear in Acts 1 and 2, as these Davidic psalms are used to describe Jesus' resurrection. But last, I'm not going to get into much of Acts. I would also comment that to help the reader along, Matthew also emphasizes that there is darkness at Jesus' death, right? The sun does go dark. The stars may not fall from heaven, but the temple curtain, chapter 27:51, again, is torn in two. And the rocks are split. The temple had stars, moon, and sun on it. The reason for that is it was supposed to look like the sky separating heaven from earth. And so when it split, it was symbolic of the cosmos, and so the cosmos is being undone. The point Matthew wants you to come away with is that the crucifixion of Jesus is the most cataclysmic, earth-shattering movement of God's judgment ever in all of history. So much so that it split the curtain, ripped open the skies, at which point Yahweh comes into the creation to rescue his Messiah and raise him from the dead. But that's only, of course, after the terrible events of the cross. And it can be easy for us to undermine the cosmic power of the cross because we talk about it so much. It's easy to just get used to it. But Matthew wants you to understand that this is the most dramatic, most significant moment in all history because it is the day of the Lord bringing his judgment on sinners for whom Jesus stands in their place. The principles of biblical theology and a proper, appreciation of the literature of Scripture, that is kind of new, right? We've throughout the Middle Ages and even after the Enlightenment, up to a guy named it doesn't matter what his name is. Dogmatic and systematic readings of the Scripture were common. So what does the church believe? Here I can show you in the Bible. As opposed to what does the Bible say on its own terms, paying attention to literary dynamics to inform our systematic theology. And now by new, I mean, I said within the last 300 years, right? And a lot of that has to do with the advent of the printing press and how common it is that people can read, right? And so biblical studies has taken off. Gabler was his last name, who gave a famous speech in the late 1700s on the proper distinction between biblical studies and dogmatics, by which he meant systematic theology. And that if biblical theology is always doing its work with an eye towards dogmatics, it will be expected to say what dogmatics wants, right? But if biblical theology can be a little more free, then it can speak on its own terms and discover what the Bible is actually saying, not constrained by dogmatic categories or systematic categories. That's not to say he was not saying systematics is bad. He's not saying it shouldn't be done. He's just saying, hey, let's just recognize these are two different disciplines here. These are two different disciplines here, and both will be better. Both will be better because there'll be more discoveries within biblical theology to provide systematic theology with more material to work with, rather than just repeating the same old things. J.P. Gabler was his name. And so since then, I think we've been living in 200 years worth of wonderful growth in biblical studies. Now, it's not without its own problems. Higher criticism, redaction criticism, form criticism, and all that kind of stuff also come in at that time. But so does your names like Voss and von Hoffmann, and eventually Beale and Goldsworthy, also emerge in that time to say, hey, there are also literary dynamics, not just historical reconstruction things that we need to be concerned about. And from that come things like this. Now, have I been convincing? I don't know. I've at least tried to show you, when will this happen? Well, the hour and the day, nobody knows. So watch. That's the big, if you really get to the point of what Jesus is saying, everything else is just kind of wending around to say, nobody knows. That's what you asked. You asked when. Nobody knows, right? I'm saying the disciples. That's what you asked. And then suddenly he starts talking about another day when he will drink it, while he's talking about drinking the cup of God's wrath. And then he talks about an hour that is upon us because I'm betrayed into sinners' hands. And this hour is upon us because you failed to watch. I mean, it seems so clear that the lines are being drawn here. The disciples thought they were talking about the temple, but Jesus said, let me show you what the real temple is. The real temple is the temple of my body that's being destroyed. And like I said yesterday in Mark, you can see how the word destroyed is being used to bring those two concepts together. And just as in Matthew, that curtain is ripped at the moment of Jesus' death, right? To further that idea that everything you thought you knew about the temple transferred to Jesus. That's a massive claim. And because Jesus is raised and collecting people from the four corners of the earth, transfer all that now to them, right? They're the community that prays and forgives and is an effective light to the nations, a house of prayer for the nations, unlike that edifice. So 40 years later, 40-year time gap, whatever, but then it goes away. And all of that sort of prepares for what more might be in store at the end, the real end of that age. Either way, that Jesus is with us until then, and we should not fear whatever kind of distress and persecution will come our way from identifying with him, from drinking cups with him. Yeah. So, been trying to emphasize, of course, the flow of thought and the contextual readings of these works. But there are other considerations, of course, to be had. And one of them is the historical confidence that we have in these works. The other is the theological consequence of the resurrection. So I'd like to take the next hour and think a bit about the historical reliability of the testimony, particularly of the resurrection. If we can establish something of the historical credibility of that, we've gone a long way, because that's clearly the most important thing. And then we'll do a little systematic theology to think about what the rest of the New Testament says about the resurrection and what it means. What is the theological significance of that? So, Lord willing, you're able to have the time to read the lecture. It was called the Fox Valley Theological Society. Doesn't really exist anymore, but it was an apologetics group where we did talks like that in libraries and community colleges in hope of stimulating discussion around important Christian matters. And one of the first ones, maybe that was the first one, was on the resurrection. And so you're able to read it. What are some of the objections to the resurrection? What are some of the objections that I laid out in that piece? Yeah, mass hallucination. Yeah. Why is that not really a plausible hypothesis? Yeah, that one person has, right. So you're not going to have a mass hallucination, right? Even still, yeah, good. What are some other objections? The swoon theory, yeah. How does that one go? Yeah, he never quite died, right? And then he emerged from the tomb and people saw him. Why does that one not really hold up under careful consideration? Yeah, this is just a daring trick that Jesus survives an assassination attempt. There's no particular divine or miraculous in such a survival, and it's not going to convince. It doesn't explain how the disciples changed, how they went from fleeing from Jesus and hiding to suddenly proclaiming him alive when all he did was barely get through an assassination attempt. If they fled in the first place because they were afraid for their lives, I can't see why seeing him crawl out of a tomb 3 days later, still quite in bad shape, would convince them to keep going for Jesus. Good. What's another one? Yeah. There's simply a criticism that, the early Christians and Jews of the first century, they're just so naive. They were so gullible that they believed everything that they heard, and so it was just easy to spin a story like a resurrection, right? And why does that not hold up to scrutiny? Yeah. It's just a little arrogant to say that we know that death is final, but the ancients didn't. All right, and they're so easily fooled. No, they had all kinds of stories and myths that emphasize the permanency of death. And again, the disciples are completely altered from who they were when Jesus lived to these brave preaching men in Jerusalem, the very city where Jesus was crucified, preaching him right there just weeks later. Something has to account for what started that, what kicked that off, what turned these men into such vocal advocates for Jesus. And simply saying that they were gullibility usually doesn't provoke perseverance and bravery that they would have needed in those first days. Now, okay, yeah. So what this is, it's a misunderstanding of typology, isn't it? Right? So typology, which is throughout the Bible, it's not just Jonah, so we're not just using typology for this question, it's throughout the Bible, that there are all kinds of episodes, events, institutions, and people in the Old Testament that prefigure something greater about Jesus, right? And so what Jesus means there is, Jonah was as good as dead. He was dead to the world, and he died a typological death, so that his emergence on the third day is typological of a resurrection. But the whole power of the New Testament, the testimony of the New Testament, is that the antitype, the fulfillment of the type, is always superior to the type. And so if Jonah, the point Jesus is making is Jonah was almost dead, Jesus is fully dead. If Jonah was like he was resurrected, Jesus was resurrected. Because remember what Jesus says, actually. He says, one greater than Jonah is here, right? So when he compares himself to Jonah on another instance, he says his experience of this 3-day episode will be greater than Jonah's. I would also point out to this Muslim friend that the idea of resurrection on the third day is throughout the Old Testament, not just in Jonah. Right? Well, another one is Isaac. Isaac travels 3 days with his father Abraham, but he comes back alive. Another one is in Esther, where the death sentence is over the people for 3 days before Esther intercedes. So the point I'm making is that this is a common motif throughout the Old Testament, building up this expectation of a 3-day literal resurrection from the Messiah. Right? Plus, I mean, don't the Muslims conclude that Barabbas replaced him on the cross or something like that? Yeah. There's just no textual evidence anywhere for that. That tradition doesn't emerge until the 7th century, right? So we're talking 700 years after Christ. Then this story comes up, right? But the stories that emerge right away, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are very clear that Jesus breathed his last, right? So you have to disagree with the Angel that Jesus breathed his last. And I think the Muslims intend to say they also believe the New Testament, right? So it's a hermeneutically dubious to say, here I'm really digging in deep into the meaning of the Jonah comparison, but when I actually look at the episode on the cross and Jesus breathed his last, gave up his spirit, I don't believe that, So that'd be my response to that. Yeah, you might say he was in. Let's count Friday as the whole day, and then Friday night, Saturday night, and maybe Sunday, right? So you could say 2 days, 2 nights, depending how you reckon it, right? But as your question indicated, the concept of a day as a 24-hour period is not the way they thought. They thought in terms of sun down to sundown. So sundown is the end of the day. No, it's the beginning, therefore the beginning of the next day until the next sundown. So the idea of taking a day and cutting it in half and calling half of it night and half of it day just isn't a common practice. Rather, day and night mean something like the day part and the night part of a full day, right? So Jesus, 3 days and 3 nights is another way of simply saying 3 cycles, right? And Friday dies on Friday, that whole day of Friday counts, and the whole day of Saturday counts, and the whole day of Sunday counts. And that's what it means to be raised on the third day. And in speaking of Jonah in the same way, he's using that kind of nomenclature and counting of days. Does that make sense? We call that inclusive counting, right? So I would say, I'm going back to America in 1 day. But they would say, I'm going back to America in 2 days. They would count today and tomorrow. Whereas I would only count from this moment right now until the next day. That's 1 day, right? But they could easily say 2 days and 2 nights, right? Because last night already counts for today, and then there's tonight and tomorrow. That would be 2 days and 2 nights in their reckoning. Yeah. And we have to just understand, the gospel writers are not dumb. They know when they say one thing, and then they have Jesus crucified on Friday and raised on Sunday, they're not intentionally contradicting themselves within the space of a few chapters. But again, Jesus reaches for that third day motif. That he insists not simply that he'll be raised, but raised on the third day because of the Old Testament tradition of life on the third day. Isaac is still alive. Jonah is still alive. The people of Israel are still alive. In fact, it says in Exodus that it's a 3-day walk from Egypt to Mount Sinai, the place of death where they're trying to kill them, to the place of life where they meet with Yahweh. Again, 3 days, the idea of movement from the death to life, typologically, in anticipation of a literal resurrection, which Jesus, of course, inaugurates. Good question. I think the most compelling objection is the legend objection. That is to say, this is a story that emerged over time as the Christian movement spread throughout the world, right? And that the earliest Christians, who knows what happened to Jesus, but somewhere along the way, he is deified, and somewhere along the way, in telling his stories, the miracles are added on, and somewhere along the way, hey, let's add on the greatest miracle of all, a resurrection, right? Do you remember seeing that one in the slow developing myth? Do you remember seeing that one? Yeah. What were some of the objections to that theory? Very good. Very good. So this development, this evolution begins with a spiritual kind of resurrection, like a ghostly resurrection, and then emerges into a physical resurrection. But it's highly dubious that sort of myth could have gotten started in the Jewish world, that is the origins of Christianity, because it's just completely un-Jewish. The Jews are pretty dogmatic that the person is the body and the soul, right? And so one is not alive if the body is not also alive with it. So the idea of a spiritual or just soulish resurrection has no place of origins in the Jewish thought world. If we're trying to propose a hypothesis that can explain the origins of the resurrection story, you would also need one to explain the origins of a Jewish spiritual resurrection. In other words, just making the problem for the historian worse, because now you have another just as unlikely scenario. The other objection is that the Jews expected not a single man to be raised, but what? Everyone to be raised, right? And to be raised at the end of time. Here, the Christians are completely unique, not clearly unique in the sense of a resurrection. They got a resurrection, but they've moved the full resurrection from everybody at the end of time to one person in the middle of time, right? So the story of the resurrection is both fits enough the Jewish context that you can see where it comes from, but equally diverse enough to show that it's not just appropriating ancient hopes in a mythological way. Something unique happened to cause them to change that idea of a group resurrection to a singular resurrection in the middle of time. And I would argue that was the actual event of the resurrection. But as we're about to see, we'll talk about how that is an already not yet fulfillment of the expectation that at the end of the age we will all also be raised. Okay, good. Any questions you had on? Anything else you want to discuss just on that piece? So the difference between those myths and Jesus is that the whole Jesus story is told in an historical context, right? So there are real places, real people. it's attempting to be historical and factual and in a lot of ways plain and unadorned. Whereas those ancient myths, no one believed that, say, Perseus or Hercules ever lived, right? But these are mythological accounts by the Greeks to explain certain morals or, political dynamics or whatever, mysteries of the world, right? And so you have a completely different genre issue there, right? And so the idea then that the Christians baptized these ways of thinking just kind of comes out of nowhere when everything else in the Gospels is so distinctly Jewish, right? And then suddenly to morph in these myths and baptize them into the Christian tradition also begs for more historical explanation. If we're trying to do history here and explain the origins of the Christian story, we have to do more work to explain the origins of where the Jews would have appropriated these other myths, right? Yeah. Again, one of the, it's coming to me now. One of the critical elements is what can account for this discussion is what can account for the change in the disciples. So they flee from, when they had their opportunity to stand with Jesus and to fight for Jesus, they ran away. And then, days later, they're back standing up for Jesus, preaching on Jesus' behalf, claiming that Jesus is alive. You would think that these guys who were afraid to stand with Jesus in his trial would be more intimidated to stand with Jesus after they saw what happened to him. But the opposite is true. So what can account for that? And a slow developing myth that happens 40 or 50 years later can't account for the events in Jerusalem in the following weeks, the preaching of the gospel, right? So we need to be able to account. That's where the hallucination theory or the swoon theory actually may or may not work, but the slow developing myth that incorporates Greco-Roman traditions over time, the key is this all takes time to convince the Christians, just simply wouldn't do it. Wouldn't create that kind of boldness. The other point I make, the second point is coming to me, is that a slow developing hypothesis that incorporates Greek myths, slow developing over time, would develop in different ways in different parts of the empire, right? As the Christians are spreading out and they don't have communication with each other, if the resurrection is developing as a myth, it'll develop differently in the north than in the west, than in Jerusalem, or down in Egypt. You follow me? Because what are the controls for how the myth will develop? And so what you would see then is disagreement between the Christians on the nature of the resurrection. Some will keep it spiritual. Some will say it happened right away. Some will say it was 5 days, some 3 days, or whatever that may be. And we do see those kinds of myths in like the Gospel of Peter and the Gospel of Mary that are written much, much later, right? Suggesting to us that the earliest accounts, therefore, are not slowly, organically developing among the populace, but what? Controlled in its narrative by a few people. Namely, the witnesses to the resurrection, the apostles in the book of Acts. Does that make sense? When you have a clear origin to a story, it's a lot easier to keep it together as it spreads out. But if it's loose and able to develop, it's going to develop in awkward and different ways, and then there's going to be conflict. You'll see in the pages of Scripture different views of the resurrection, but that's not what we have. Very clear in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and Paul, that this is a bodily resurrection, and it portends, therefore, our own physical resurrection in the future. And it's always on the third day. It's always on the third day. Good. Okay, well, let's turn now then to the theology and philosophy of the resurrection, mainly theology. Okay, I'm going to assign some verses, and I want you to think what is reflective in these verses of the significance of the resurrection. Why is the resurrection significant? What theological payoff is there from these verses, okay? So why don't we start over here? Abel and group, you guys have 1 Corinthians 15, 20 through 28, okay? You're going to have a whole 5 minutes, okay, to discuss and really think deeply about what are the ramifications of the resurrection, more than just, hey, that dead man is now alive, okay, therefore, what? You guys can take Acts 2, 22 through 36. Acts 2, 22 through 36. And the group back there, you guys can take Romans 4, 13 to 24. Romans 4, 13 to 24. And then after 5 minutes, we'll discuss, and then I'll give you more texts, because there's a lot. Okay? Great.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah. So the question is, what is the theological consequence of the resurrection? Because Jesus is raised, so what? Right? More than just a great miracle, it's got impact on our theology. Yeah. Okay, that's time. Let's hear what you got. All right, here we go. Group 1's going to share with us now, and then you guys will be able to share as well. So what do we learn from Ephesians 1 and 2 about the theological meaning of the resurrection? Okay, so the greatness of his power in us who believe, that power is specifically the power of the resurrection. Okay? The spiritual resurrection. Interesting. So in 1 Corinthians, it assured us of our physical resurrection in the future. Now it's also the power that animates our spiritual life now. Tell me more. Where do you see that? Where do you see that? Chapter 2:6? Yes. Yeah. So God is rich in mercy. Verse 5, even though we were dead through our trespasses, God made us alive together with Christ, raised us up with him, and made us sit with him in the heavenly places. I think that's amazing. In Ephesians 1:20, Christ is raised and made to sit in the heavenly places. 6:2, we are raised with him and made to sit in the heavenly places. Let's wrap our minds around that. Jesus is raised and seated at the right hand of God in heaven, 1:20, and 2:6, we are seated with him. So, in some way, Paul believes that we are in heaven already. I mean, think about that. You're in Addis Ababa, but Paul says you're in heaven. What does that mean? You ever thought about that? What does it mean to sit in heavenly places? I think it has to do with the rest of the chapter, where by the end, say verse 19, 2:19, fellow citizens and saints and members of the household of God, verse 20, built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Christ Jesus himself being the cornerstone, in whom the whole structure is joined together and grows into a holy temple in the Lord, in whom you are built into a dwelling place of God for the Spirit. So he's, again, using, as I've already discussed, but not looked at this passage yet, the church is the temple of God, right? You are growing into a holy temple in the Lord, verse 21. Well, again, what is the temple? The temple is the place where heaven commingles with earth, right? And so Jesus is seated in heaven. We are seated on the earth. If we are seated with him, we're on heaven and earth at the same time, means we are, therefore, that nexus point between heaven and earth. And our station before God is assured and immovable, as Christ is seated at the right hand, never to be moved, and he has us seated there with him. It's a theological status before God that we are in his presence even already, even while we're living here on earth. If Jesus is in heaven, so strong is our union with him, then in some sense, so are we. And it's the theology of the temple that makes sense of that, rather than this mystical, well, how can you be in two places at the same time? It's not that we're in two places at the same time, but that two places have come together. And where have they come together? In the church. So we are in the world and we're in heaven. And thereby we enjoy the presence of God and sit with Christ as he reigns, putting all his enemies under his feet.
Verse 2.
Yes, right, verse 2. I see. So you're noticing the similarity in the pattern of verses 1, 20, and 21, as well as 2:2 and 2:6, right? To lead us through kind of the flow of thought. Good. Yeah, I mean, that's good reading. When you notice repeated phrases, then you're also noticing something of the logical flow from one to the other. Yeah, good. Good. Other thoughts from this group? Our mystical union with Christ means that we are already in heaven. Okay, group 2. You guys had a hard one. Let's all go to Hebrews 2 and see if we can work on this together.
We had just the resurrection.
Yeah, so the crowned with glory and honor is the resurrection.
Yeah.
Good. That's right. Yeah. Hey, let's take a look at Psalm 8. We don't have to look at all of it. Let's just look at what's in Hebrews 2 here. So in verse 5, Hebrews 2:5, for it was not to angels that God subjected the world to come, of which we are speaking, but it has been testified, what is man that thou art mindful of him? So just pause right there. Verse 5, he's saying, listen, the world to come will not be ruled by angels. The world to come will be ruled by a man. What is man that you are mindful of him? Okay? Now, why use Psalm 8 for this? Let's keep reading. What is man that you are mindful of him, or the son of man that thou carest for him? You did make him a little lower than the angels, and thou hast crowned him with glory and honor, putting everything in subjection under his feet. That's Psalm 8, okay? If we read the rest of Psalm 8, we'll notice that the man in Psalm 8 is who? It's Adam, exactly. And the all thing in subjection under his feet is the creation. And so he's saying when God made humanity, he made humanity to be the ruler of his creation. And from that point of rulership, to exercise the dominion of God so that he will be crowned with glory and honor. So the dominion that humanity has over the earth is given to him by God as his glory and honor. And then let's continue in verse 8. This is now Hebrews reflecting on that. Now in putting everything in subjection to him, he left nothing outside his control. As it is, we do not yet see everything in subjection to him. We look at the world and we see it's out of control. It's not under control. Adam and his posterity don't have everything under control. We're not crowned with glory and honor. Principally, the primary evidence of that, of course, is death. Right? We can't control death. And so the writer of Hebrews is saying the expectation for humanity. Why did God create humanity? Just for us to muck around on the earth and suffer every day until the day we die? Or no, there's a purpose. There's a telos to be the crown of creation that rules over creation and brings the creation into submissive worship of God. But the writer of Hebrews is saying, Psalm 8 is reflecting on that, but it is not happening. But it's not happening. But then he goes on in verse 9, but we see Jesus, who for a little while was made lower than the angels. Now by that he's simply saying he was made man, because he just got done saying man is made a little lower than the angels. So by saying that, he's not comparing Jesus ontologically to the angels. Some the Jehovah's Witnesses say things like that. He's simply saying this God is also made man. Why? So they could crown him with glory and honor because of the suffering of death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. Christ, therefore, has ascended, therefore, to that place that Adam never attained to. The rulership of creation. And so what that means is, in the resurrection, God's purposes for humanity are accomplished. Again, God did not just create us to just live out our miserable days on earth and die, like Ecclesiastes is reflecting, right? He created us for a purpose, to be the crown and glory of creation and thereby bring creation into submissive obedience to God. That has failed, but in Christ, that plan is being, with the resurrection specifically, being put back on the right track. And so I conclude that the resurrection completes God's purposes for humanity. The glory and honor Adam was supposed to attain to, Christ has now attained, and he is also pulling us to that place as well so that we can reign with him over creation. Which means if you're a Christian, you are living out the purposes for which God made humanity in the first place, which is a pretty good thing when in our world today, at least where I come from, maybe you have the same problem, there's a lot of questions of what is the purpose of humanity? What is the value of life? What is the meaning of life? When people can't answer those questions, it results in a lot of depression. Why am I here? Would the world be better off if I wasn't? What's the meaning of life? What's the purpose of life? What is good? What is true? What is beautiful? What is truly valuable? Right? If we can't answer those questions, then day after day it's just a meaningless search for food until we run out and die. You understand? But the Christian worldview is that no, the purpose for humanity is to attain this glory and honor over rulership of the creation, and Christ is leading the way there by virtue of his resurrection. It gives a purpose and a telos to our days. Okay, group three. Group three, you guys had a really good one. Chapter 6, 1 through 14. Everybody turn there. Romans 6. Romans 6. This has some similarities to Ephesians, but I think also some extra things to say. Who's the spokesperson for group 3? Abdullah? Okay. Lay it on us. What did you learn from Romans 6? Good. So what you're saying, if I'm hearing you right, where does it say we're united to Christ? Verse 5, right? Yeah. But are you also saying that in verse 3, being baptized into his death is a term for union, being united to him, put into him? Good. Okay. I agree. Good. Keep going. But what you're saying there is you've still got us dead.
Well, we are raised.
We are raised. There we go. I didn't quite hear that. Good. Yeah. So verse 4, buried therefore in baptism, so that we are raised as Christ was raised. So that as Christ was raised from the dead by God the Father, so too we might walk in the newness of life. Right? There it is, right? Yeah, very good. Maybe you said that and I just didn't quite catch it. So being dead to the consequence of sin and to the enslavement of sin is one thing, but now being liberated to live this new and free life in Christ is what I call regeneration, right? This is what John means by being born again. We are raised. Why? Well, one, there's this identity and a location and enjoying of God's presence because we're seated in heaven. But this is focusing then on how do we live our lives, right? The source of our regeneration is Christ's resurrection. It's as though, I think I can say more than it is though. It is true that regeneration is a spiritual resurrection. We therefore have already been raised. Even as Ephesians 2 said, dead in trespasses, alive, now seated with him. So too here, sin no longer has this dominion over us because we're dead to it, but we are also raised. And so when Jesus was raised from the dead, a power was released into the world to change people from the inside out. This is Moses' new heart, circumcised heart. This is Jeremiah's new heart. This is what it means to be born again. A lot of different ways it's described that when you become a Christian, you don't just get forgiven of your sins. You get filled with the Holy Spirit to live in these new capacities, newness of life, free from sins. And all of that is possible because Jesus' resurrection was like popping the balloon with all this force that released this power of new life into the world that Christians get to enjoy. Book of Acts makes that a little more clear. What we mean by that is when he was raised, he also ascended to heaven and gave the Spirit. So I think that's ultimately how to explain that. But it's critical to make that connection between the resurrection, opening up the gates for the gift of the Spirit. Good. Anything else from group 3? Abdullah, anything else you want to throw in there? Okay. So what have we seen? Number 1, because of the resurrection of Christ, the resurrection has begun. If the Jews of the first century expected a communal resurrection, it started. I think that's the way to understand it, right? The first resurrection, the first fruits has happened. The rest is coming soon, and that gives us a confidence. Number 2, it teaches us that the reign of the great Son of David has already begun because the resurrection is the means by which God placed him on the throne of David. That was the Acts 2 business. The resurrection completes God's purposes to Abraham, wherein through the resurrection, Christ has now inherited the world, and the world is made up of Jews and Gentiles who trust in, believe in, have confidence in Jesus' resurrection, and that's the kind of faith that God counts us as righteous, us just like Abraham. Number 4, I would say it reinforces the temple theology and what we mean by that and why it's important, because it means we are dwelling in the very presence of God if we are dwelling amongst God's people, the church. Number 5, it completes the purposes for humanity. And number 6, it is the means by which regeneration and the gift of the Spirit come to his people. I think we could also add, just in passing, it marks the end of the exile, because in Ezekiel 37, there's a great vision of the valley of the dry bones, and it says, when I bring my people back, I will raise them up out of their graves. So Jesus' resurrection is the quintessential mark of return from exile. I think we can also say it's the beginning of the new creation. In John chapter 1, in the beginning was the Word, and then John goes on to talk about light and darkness and a man and so forth, all kinds of Genesis language, as though to say his gospel story is the new creation story, which climaxes only with the resurrection on the first day of the next week. The 8th day in John is therefore the beginning of this new world. So the resurrection is the beginning of the new creation. Christ is the new covenant head in Romans 5. I think it gives us confidence in that the Bible is the revelation of God. Again, that comes from John. It's the beginning of the session of Christ. Is that a term you guys know? The session of Christ, right? So he ascends to that place where he can intercede for us because of his resurrection. And I think in Revelation 12, the apocalyptic imagery there suggests that Jesus, of course, is the seed of the woman, and by virtue of his resurrection, he is accomplishing all the purposes of God for all history. Not just for humanity, but for all of history. Right? Not just for Christians, but for all of history. So there is so many things that fill out the rest of our biblical theology that have to pass through Jesus' resurrection. Jesus' resurrection, the door to understanding all these other things. If you look at the bottom there, there's an Eastern Orthodox icon. I don't love pictures of Jesus, right? But this is one that I can't resist. He was a man, so you could portray him as a man. Here's just a man. But he clearly represents Jesus. In fact, those letters to the left and to the right of his shawl stand for Jesus Christ. And what's he doing in that picture? He's coming out of a tomb. So down at his feet is a casket, a burial casket that he's broken open. You understand? And he's rising up out of it. And with his right hand, what's he doing? What's he doing with his right hand? Yeah, he's pulling somebody else out of their grave with him. That's probably Adam. If we went to that church and we traced all the icons all around the building to wherever they have the icons of creation, their icon would look like that guy. So, of course, Adam represents what? All of humanity. And so Jesus' resurrection is not just a historical curiosity of the first century. Where did Christianity come from? Why did the apostles change their posture? Can we defend this historically? Yep, all that stuff's important. But the main point is that by Jesus' resurrection, he is raised up and he's pulling us up with him. Pulling us up out of the snare that is sin and liberating us to live lives of freedom in Christ, Romans 6, seating us in the heavenly places. And all of that gives us a confidence that at the end of the age, 1 Corinthians 15, we will all also be raised physically as well to live with him eternally. So you can find that icon in pretty much every Orthodox church. I don't know about Ethiopian Orthodox churches. I don't know how often you go in them. You find them, but it's very common to see icons of the resurrection where Jesus is not just coming out of the grave, but he's coming out of the grave and pulling others with him. I think it's a powerful image. Because the eyes of Christian faith are actually the ears, right? Hear, O Israel, right? Go and preach the kingdom. Go and teach them all whatever I commanded you. So I don't use icons because it doesn't seem like the Bible teaches us to use icons.